As modern thinking reevaluates society's focus on inclusivity and representation, a new era of hip-hop-based architecture confronts the traditions of a predominantly white practice with a diverse culture of hip-hop and severely underrepresented world of Black design. In simple terms, hip-hop architecture explores the connection of hip-hop culture and the built environment, specifically through media, professional practice, and academia. The goal of hip-hop architecture is to increase the number of underrepresented populations in architecture, and with these connections, it makes it more possible. Hip-hop architecture, a field pioneered by architect Sekou Cooke, is meant to create a new approach to architecture and design by amplifying and increasing the number of underrepresented populations in the field of architecture. While studying architecture at Cornell University, Cooke and a group of Black students were frustrated with the predominantly white architecture curriculum. They began to focus on the study of hip-hop architecture, which incorporates the identity and culture of hip-hop with the built environment. Cooke and others define how hip-hop architecture is constantly changing with culture and how it exists as a form of protest and representation. It's hard to define an expression of a culture often overshadowed by figures of a biased past. Sekou Cooke is a Jamaican-born architectural practitioner, educator, and a teaching assistant at Syracuse University's School of Architecture. Sekou's studio grew out of his commitment to architectural practice, which included diverse residential and commercial projects in New York, mixed-use projects in California and San Francisco, and speculative developments in Liberia and Jamaica, his native country. Sekou Cooke defines hip-hop architecture as a culture's values. He says, "These days when I start defining hip-hop architecture, I start by defining architecture. I used to start with defining what hip-hop is, but now I find that more people don't know what architecture is, even in architecture circles. To me, I like to define architecture as a culture's values. It's a physical manifestation of the zeitgeist." During modernization, architects from both the East and West, for example, Le Corbusier and Kisho Kurokawa, used their architecture as a language to respond to the age, which led to the birth of modernism. On the other hand, after the hip-hop movement, architecture became a manifestation of the cultural change and self-identification for a society. In the past, only a small group of people were entitled to convey their ideas through designing spaces. However, contemporary designers who focus on hip-hop designs can now provide a broader access to the public to freely represent who they are. For example, Virgil Abloh, the CEO of Off-White, shows his streetwear design from multiple aspects, including, but not limited to, fashion, furniture, and exhibition. Along with the rapid transformation of beliefs and self-concepts, more and more people are motivated to express themselves in an innovative way through creating spaces. Thus, hip-hop architecture precisely satisfies the need of people in the contemporary world, reflecting their values, thoughts, and cultures. Before the age of hip-hop, the famed architectural theorist Le Corbusier had a direct influence on the birth of hip-hop culture. Corbusier was especially fascinated by music, specifically jazz, emerging from the Black community during the Harlem Renaissance. His musings, however, are coupled with his design for towers in the park, the design that influenced the standardized low-income housing construction aimed at Black and minority communities across the United States. The government ignored a highly significant criticism of Corbusier's plan. The sociological impact of living in such a monotonous, mechanical environment would inevitably create a culture of rebellion and disorder. This criticism served as a prediction for hip-hop culture. Hip-hop is a response to this oppressive design of low-income housing. Though hip-hop would not exist without architecture, the study of hip-hop-infused architecture is still relatively recent. According to Cooke, each major cultural era in Western society, the Renaissance, the Baroque, modernism, enlisted a plurality of creative outlets: theater, music, dance, fine art, and architecture. The first four art forms find their counterparts in the four pillars of hip-hop: DJing, MCing, b-boying, and graffiti writing. Architecture is lost. As Cooke works to define and identify hip-hop architecture, the culture steadily inspires design within the Black community. Not only does hip-hop architecture serve as a creative outlet for Black communities and their designers, it also serves as a source of criticism of the traditional views of architecture. As it becomes a more prevalent part of the developed culture of hip-hop architecture also exposes the predominantly and presumed white curriculum of architecture and the way Black architecture has been subjected to oppressive otherness in practice and community.
While hip-hop architecture derives from the culture of hip-hop and the different modes of creative expression, the architectural style stands within the discourse of hip-hop culture. From the existing counterparts of study, they display the amplification of Black culture and the flourishing of Black architects and designers, including Michael Ford, hip-hop architecture pioneer. Ford lectures and hosts events around the United States, and similarly to Cooke, attributes a large part of hip-hop culture to low-income housing and urban renewal projects like those proposed by Robert Moses in the 1960s. He believes that without the oppressive environments like these, hip-hop and its many forms of expression would not exist, in a similar way to how hip-hop music brought Black musicians through struggle to prominence. Hip-hop architecture can bring more Black creators into the light through its social presence in opposition of the current system of oppression. The other major parts of hip-hop culture are as follows. DJ composition differs where a wide variety of techniques produce different tonal qualities. The ability to breathe new life from pre-existing popular musical forms is remarkable, gathering familiar icons while breaking the standard conventions where hip-hop architecture values lay. DJ techniques such as sampling, scratches, and crossfades allow carefully calibrated transitions between layers to create continuity between elements, but can also be utilized for counteracting race and class discrimination, as well as mitigate the negative effects that gentrification can have upon an urban city and development when applied in architecture. In urban settings where cities are continually growing, DJ composition is a diverse quality where hip-hop architecture strives to find a voice and style within the gentrification. B-boying, or breakdancing, has realized many commercial successes both abroad and within the United States. B-boying takes the art of dance and adds a new style of fluidity and motion, similarly to how hip-hop architecture integrates space. The art form of graffiti has a spatial quality that speaks at various levels of complexity. What was once seen as an illegal and defiant act of vandalism has progressed to being integrated within pop culture, museums, and public commissions. The MoMA, National Gallery, and public commissions such as street art and murals are prime examples of how graffiti has evolved in the public eye. Hip-hop has always been the contrarian, rejecting the inevitability of the commercial market decision-making, creating its own culture and styles through the hyper-rational concrete jungle. From the traditional structure, hip-hop architecture has strayed widely, but has allowed for the growing success of differing markets, much like the different forms of hip-hop that have become normalized and successful today. Another intention of hip-hop architecture is to amplify the work of Black architects and designers through time, many of whom have gone widely unrecognized in the profession as a whole. Many significant architects such as Paul R. Williams, Robert R. Taylor, and Moses McKissick III, to name a few, were largely outshadowed during the 20th century. As stated in the following excerpt from the theory piece, Rap Space, The Architecture of Hip-Hop, by architect and activist Craig L. Wilkins, hip-hop architecture facilitates an expression of Black culture largely missed in previous decades. He says, the charge here is to remake and reclaim the Black subject from the Negro object, and this calls for the remaking of these places, the erasure of the dominant proper, and the repositioning of these urban spaces as empowering. Here, Wilkins states a need to separate the humanity and individuality of Black citizens from the outdated and marginalized view of their race in urban context, and that doing so through the modification of urban space can showcase these people's cultures and creativity. In a slight contrast to Cooke's statement that architecture is lost as a hip-hop art form, Wilkins believes that just as hip-hop music has a signature flow and rhythm, hip-hop architecture takes a path in visually expressing these themes seen most prominently in the other key sections of hip-hop culture. As stated in an article he wrote for Architectural Record, Cooke believes that the lack of representation for Black architects and creators is fundamentally hurting architecture due to the massive unseen culture that is ignored as a result of the pre-existing system. He also continues to highlight the fact how Black people live and use their space has a profound impact on the development of urban areas. The effects of these people's lives are tied to the built world, and hip-hop architecture gives this effect a tangible form. Cooke also makes a point that while the architecture and design community increasingly show support for its Black participants, it is seemingly assumed that the Black community and design profession are disconnected. The predominantly white lens through which architecture is viewed and taught is partly why Black creativity is often silenced and separated from the profession. Outside of academia, architecture directly affects the people that inhabit it. Architecture designed the oppressive urban structure, the housing projects, the public prisons, environments to keep Black and minority communities poor and separate. These designs ignored warnings of inevitable violence and poverty, directly contributing to the country's deeply rooted racism and resulting in decades of blatant discrimination and hardship. Even today, a number of architects openly display their willingness to design a border wall. In Cooke's words, the idea that Black and designer or Black and architect can be one and the same is absent from the language used by many of these leaders of architectural education. The design community may support the Black community, but it has long ways to go in addressing and severing itself from its discriminatory roots. Through hip-hop architecture, the Black community can attain some design justice. It can allow Black designers and architects to rethink the oppressive design born from modernism using their experiences and culture that shaped them. Many urban communities which were designed with gentrification in mind, with the explicit intention of trapping people of color in low-income, low-opportunity neighborhoods, are being revitalized. Hip-hop architecture and its practitioners are actively fighting back against decades of oppression in a way that truly accentuates the hip-hop spirit. Using similar rhetoric to that of the rest of the hip-hop world, hip-hop architecture confirms the statement that architecture is the built realization of culture and its defiance of and growth from systems that oppressed its founders. As it grows and develops, it will force the rest of the field to be redefined, making room for the Black creators that has so desperately been missing for so long.